In 2001, 20th Century Fox released Moulin Rouge, kicking off a trend of bringing live-action musicals back to the big screen as big-budget tentpoles with films like Chicago, Dreamgirls, Hairspray, Sweeney Todd, The Demon Barber of Fleet Street, and Mamma Mia hitting theaters. One thing you'll notice about these films versus Moulin Rouge is that they're all adaptations of popular stage musicals. Yes, revitalizing and bringing back the movie musical sounded fun and all, but studios wanted to make sure they were making their returns. One studio that took a long time to make their mark on this trend was Disney, who'd found much success with animated musicals, TV musicals on ABC and Disney Channel, and the occasional Muppet film. Rob Marshall, who directed Chicago for Disney's Miramax division, sought to change that. On Christmas Day 2014, Walt Disney Pictures released the long-awaited film adaptation of Stephen Sondheim's Into the Woods in theaters, their first, and as of this publication, only film adaptation of a Broadway musical. The musical had gained a large reputation among avid theater fans and general theatergoers through a 1991 recording of the show's original Broadway cast, originally aired on PBS's American Playhouse, as well as thousands of community, regional, and touring performances of the show throughout the world. The film adaptation went through various readings, drafts, and studios before finally landing at Disney in 2012 with director Rob Marshall, and it was a departure from Disney's usual fare. While based on fairy tales like many Disney films, Into the Woods is notably darker in tone and theme than most Disney films. There's infidelity, there's death, and lots of it. There's a lot about the gray area of morality and how we all do good and bad things. It's a dense piece. Add to this that Stephen Sondheim's music, while brilliant, is incredibly unlike the cheery, hummable tunes of Disney's most prolific composers like Ashman and Menken, the Lopez's, and the Sherman Brothers. Was Into the Woods a good fit at Disney, the home of escapism and optimism? Or was Into the Woods a good choice to adapt to film in any case? After the taping of the original Broadway cast of Into the Woods aired on PBS, studios almost immediately started developing a film adaptation, primarily at Columbia and Jim Henson Productions. I will take this moment to say that the casts at some of these early readings are unreal, and I would have loved to see how they would have performed this. Anyway, by around 1997, Into the Woods was put on indefinite hold. In my last video on Newsies, I talked about how standard live-action movie musicals weren't selling in the early 90s, and this still mostly held up. Evita, based on Andrew Lloyd Webber's hit musical, made a profit in 1996 and resulted in 5 Oscar nominations. But it had mixed critical reception, suggesting that live-action musicals might still be a risk. Then, the tidal wave of live-action movie musicals throughout the 2000s hit theaters with varying degrees of financial and/or critical success. I won't dive too far into this era of filmmaking, as this video is already very long, but know this. Producers around this time leaned into movie musicals that felt like safe bets, musicals that would potentially bring either major critical attention or major commercial appeal, hopefully both. Chicago, directed by Rob Marshall, was and still is the last musical to win Best Picture at the Oscars, and it is one of the biggest proponents of this era, netting 13 Oscar nominations and a worldwide box office of $306.8 million. Following Chicago, Marshall directed Memoirs of a Geisha, 9, and Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tides, his most commercially successful film, making more than $1 billion worldwide. This large box office sum, plus remaining goodwill from making Chicago for Miramax, made Marshall feel all the more confident as he approached Disney with his next project idea. Marshall had wanted to put a Sondheim work on film since around Chicago's release, noting either Follies or Sweeney Todd as possibilities. Stephen Sondheim told Rob Marshall that he believed that Into the Woods was more Marshall's speed. Years later, Marshall took the idea to Walt Disney Pictures chairman Sean Bailey, who was unsurprisingly skeptical of the film's darker subject matter. Nevertheless, he okayed a 3-day staged reading in New York of the film's screenplay, adapted by the show's original playwright James Lapine. Shortly after, the film got the green light and pre-production officially began. Short side note, it's also worth noting that around this time, the 2012 film adaptation of Les Miserables was going through a heavy promotional tour and was expected to make a grand financial and critical showing, which it did. It made nearly $500,000 worldwide and garnered 8 Oscar nominations with 3 wins. While there's no record of Disney citing this as an official reason for giving Into the Woods the go-ahead, I think it's safe to assume it had some pull. Casting for Into the Woods was an interesting process. Meryl Streep was cast almost immediately as the witch. Allison Janney was in, and then she wasn't. Jake Gyllenhaal was in, and then he wasn't. Sophia Grace, aka the little British girl who performed super bass on Ellen with her sister, made it all the way to rehearsals before being cut from the film. A few relative unknowns made it into the cast as well. Billy Magnuson, Mackenzie Mousey, this guy, I don't know who he is. They got the kid from Les Mis to play Jack, and Billboard Top 10 recording artist Anna Kendrick was cast as Cinderella. Oh, and Christine Baranski, who should just be in every movie musical ever, was cast as the stepmother. The film was primarily shot over a 2-month period, mostly on sound stages at Shepperton Studios in London, with some additional locations throughout England. From what I can tell, once the casting drama had been taken care of, production itself went smoothly. The only notable accommodation that had to be made was for Emily Blunt, who was pregnant during filming. Initial production ended on November 27, 2013, with some additional material filmed after initial screenings for Disney execs in July 2014. The first teaser trailer for the film dropped in August 2014, with subsequent promotion following up to its release on Christmas Day. Critical reviews praised Meryl Streep and Emily Blunt's performances, as well as the film's production design and costuming. Some critics praised the respect and care taken in adapting the original musical to film, while others objected on the grounds that it was either too faithful or muted the themes of the original source material. Audience reception was mixed, with many parents complaining about the film's darker subject matter in the second half, namely the affair between Baker's wife and Cinderella's prince, as well as the deaths of Jack's mother and the baker's wife. In the end, the film was nominated for 3 Golden Globes, Best Supporting Actress for Meryl Streep, Best Actress in a Comedy or Musical for Emily Blunt, and Best Picture Comedy or Musical. And it was nominated for 3 Oscars: Production Design, Costuming, and Best Supporting Actress for Meryl Streep, her 19th Oscar nomination. Why was the reception from critics and audiences so mixed? Based on the film's box office, there obviously wasn't a lack of appeal. How did Into the Woods land with such a resounding meh? I will go ahead and admit that marketing something like Into the Woods seems like a daunting task. It's a fantasy musical based on Grimm's fairy tales that's a comedy in the first half and a hard-hitting drama in the second half. Even trying to describe the musical to friends usually warrants an "I promise it's really good." Disney is notorious in how it operates its brand. The way the company has operated all the way back to Walt's era has primarily focused on 1. Making entertainment intended for families, and 2. Making a ton of money in the process. Occasionally, risks would be taken, like Disneyland and Snow White's original release, but for the most part, the output is relatively focus grouped. Too big to fail type projects, especially since Bob Iger became CEO of the company. Walt Disney Pictures was in an interesting position in 2014. 4 years earlier, the darker turn on Alice in Wonderland, directed by Tim Burton, had sent shockwaves through the film industry after it made over $1 billion worldwide. Modern twists on classic fairy tales and stories were suddenly being sent to theaters, with varying degrees of success. In the 2 years before Into the Woods, Disney released Oz the Great and Powerful and Maleficent, which both did well at the worldwide box office. The problem here is that Into the Woods, while darker in tone, is not like that. It's darker in tone and theme rather than aesthetics. It's not the kind of thing that would sell merchandise at Hot Topic. So even if Disney attempted to market it to that crowd, which they didn't really, but some people who didn't know the show thought it might be one of those kinds of films, it wouldn't meet those expectations. Disney also has a long history of films based on fairy tales, mostly animated and with undeniably happy endings. Into the Woods, in fact, includes 2 characters who are part of the Disney princess line, Cinderella and Rapunzel. This aspect led to some confusion among Disney circles. Cinderella and Rapunzel were there, but was it Disney Cinderella and Rapunzel? Cinderella is blonde in the parks, why is Anna Kendrick still a brunette? And why is her dress gold? I even remember seeing someone on Tumblr try to claim before release that the film was a live-action remake of Tangled, which, no. But given how embedded Disney's legacy was with its animated fairy tales, and now live-action retellings of those fairy tales, this confusion is sort of reasonable. Also of note, Disney's live-action remake of Cinderella was set to be released less than 3 months after Into the Woods, adding another layer of confusion. Into the Woods, amidst all of this confusion, also ended up with a PG rating from the MPAA. Walt Disney Pictures rarely dips into PG-13 territory, save for the Pirates of the Caribbean films and 2013's Saving Mr. Banks, so this is, in the end, not surprising, but it continued to push the idea that Into the Woods would be a film for families. PG at this point is the most common MPAA rating for family films, with other Disney films at the time like Frozen, Muppets Most Wanted, and Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day all receiving PG ratings. Those films are wildly different in tone from Into the Woods, which is not entirely inaccessible to kids over, let's say, about 10 years old, but also not what's usually sold to them. And this confusion of is Into the Woods a family film or not still happens. Even while researching for this essay, I saw a listing for the film being shown on Starz Kids. I feel like this issue could have been solved if Disney had had the option to distribute this film on their Touchstone, Miramax, or Hollywood Pictures labels, but they were all seemingly unavailable at the time for various reasons. The only people who really had any general idea of what to expect with Into the Woods were people who knew the original stage musical. Like I said earlier, it's a dense piece. The stage musical's runtime clocks in at about 2.5 hours. The movie, meanwhile, is 117 minutes without the credits. In a few interviews, Rob Marshall talks about how they had to get it down to 2 hours, which I don't agree with. Les Mis was about 160 minutes and people showed up. But this points to the fact that elements of the musical would be cut and reworked, for better or worse, to stay consistent with Disney's brand. In the 2 years leading up to Into the Woods, the longest film released by Walt Disney Pictures was Oz the Great and Powerful, clocking in at 130 minutes. As I stated earlier, producers wanted safe bets, and lowering the runtime seemed like a safe bet. So we have the dark fairy tale, but not like that aspect. It's a Disney movie with princesses, but not a Disney princess movie aspect, the question of whether or not it's a family film, and the question of whether or not it's a faithful adaptation of the original musical. Audience expectations were scattered, to say the least, but the audiences still showed up, and most of them were, to some level, disappointed. Speaking for myself, I fell into the last camp of audience expectation. Would this be a faithful adaptation of the stage musical? So, was it? Adapting something from one medium to another is difficult. Adapting a musical from the stage to film, while definitely not impossible, is a Herculean task. Here's writer-composer Howard Ashman talking about musical adaptation in 1988.
Do you not think that making a film out of a musical is a different process entirely than making a film out of a play?
Yeah, I think.
And do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, it's an exercise in stupid.
At first glance, even with what's changed, the film adaptation of Into the Woods is very faithful to the original. None of the scenes or songs are rearranged, some are simply removed. Upon my first viewing of the film, I thought, wow, this was done with so much respect. And in a way, it was. It's incredibly clear that everyone involved loves Sondheim and Lapine's stage musical, and I do not fault them for wanting to respect the source material or for wanting to honor the show's fans by giving them a slightly altered version of what they'd expected. The thing is, though, there's nothing wrong with changing things around during adaptation. I'm stating the obvious here, but theater and film are incredibly different mediums, more different than I think most people give them credit for, and this starts with the writing and structure. Take, for example, that against its stage adaptation, the 2007 film adaptation of Hairspray adds 2 songs, removes 4 songs entirely, and majorly restructures the plot and character motivations. And it's a delightful film. It admittedly has some problems with its subject matter that I won't dive into here, but it's an entertaining film that works because they weren't afraid to restructure the source material. In Into the Woods, it's very clear where Act 1 ends and Act 2 begins. This isn't new. Some movie musicals, primarily in the 50s and 60s, had built-in intermissions during their roadshow releases to try to emulate the feeling of being at a live performance. And that Act 1 to Act 2 feeling still happens, noticeably in Netflix's recent film adaptation of The Prom. Using alternate structures for film writing, i.e. not using a 3-act structure, is not inherently a bad thing, and I honestly encourage it. 3-act structure gets monotonous sometimes. But if you're going to use an alternate structure, you have to find a way to warrant it. In the Act 2 section of the film adaptation of Into the Woods, in my opinion, is done incredibly poorly. Into the Woods, the stage musical, uses about 80 minutes for Act 1 and about 70 minutes for Act 2. Into the Woods, the movie, uses 76 minutes for Act 1 and 41 minutes for Act 2. Remember when How I Met Your Mother reached the final episode and the series had spent so much time letting the characters grow and change throughout the series, only for them to bombard the audience with tons of new, important information that was both overwhelming and unsatisfying? For me, that's how the movie version of Into the Woods feels. For the most part, the Act 1 section of the film is fine. Not perfect, but fine. But it really just falters in its expedited version of Act 2. By taking the time to finesse the characters' situations and motivations in the stage musical, everything that happens to them makes sense and feels like a natural progression. Meanwhile, in the film, there's no time to transition into the events of Act 2. It all just starts happening. There's also a diluting of the show's themes that dampens the emotional weight of the film. Rapunzel's non-death in the film is difficult to unpack. The crux of the relationship between the witch and Rapunzel is that the witch is ultimately correct about the dangers of the world outside of Rapunzel's tower, but that she doesn't do anything to prepare Rapunzel for those dangers. In the stage musical, the world's terrors hit Rapunzel at full force, making it difficult for her to comprehend anything around her, ultimately driving her to her death. This death sets up the emotional weight of Witch's Lament perfectly, showing that the witch still believes that she was right to shield Rapunzel from the world and informing her actions and attitudes for the rest of the musical, especially her line, "I'm not good, I'm not bad, I'm just right," during Last Midnight. In the film, because the weight of the world doesn't hit Rapunzel nearly as much, she gets to ride off to her assumed happy ending with her prince, and Witch's Lament reads more as the witch simply being sad about Rapunzel leaving rather than as a vindication for the lessons she tried to instill in her. This dampens the theme of how parents' decisions inform children's actions tremendously. Speaking of which, the Baker's arc in the film Adaptation hurts with the absence of the mysterious man's constant presence in the first act. I am admittedly biased in how I think the Baker storyline should play out for reasons, but there are some questionable changes. The buildup of the Baker's view of his father in the stage musical builds nicely and organically, leading to the moment of realization during No More that's necessary for him to return to his son. In the film, he's immediately resentful of his father upon learning that he stole the witch's beans, and it leads to a very sudden and stark tone change in his character, and it's awkwardly executed. Without the mysterious man, there's no real emotional arc with the complicated relationship between the Baker and his father, and how that'll affect the Baker's actions as a father himself. Rather, the Baker in the film just sort of accepts early on that he'll be a bad father because his father was, and then after Ghost Dad appears for about 30 seconds, he's kind of like, actually, no, I think I'll be okay. The omission of No More makes this sudden shift even more undeserved. In the stage musical When We Reach No More, the Baker has lost everything. His parents, his wife, his home, and it all hits like a brick when the mysterious man, a trickster rather than just a bad father, reappears. The Baker gets No More as a moment to process and cope with all the trauma he's faced as a father, a son, and a husband. In the film, he sits on a tree, cries for a few seconds, and then heads back. It's not nearly as emotionally resonant, and it steers away from the heavy themes of parents and children at the core of the source material. However, the absence of the mysterious man also makes me wonder, was there any way that Into the Woods was ever going to work on film? It would have been really nice to have the mysterious man for the Baker's character arc and relationship with his father, but I worry that even if he'd been present, the trickster tone of his character would have clashed with the rest of the film. There's also the issue with the narrator. The stage musical has a narrator who appears on stage and is not present in the film version. There's narration for the Act 1 portion of the film by James Corden, but the narrator is not a full-on character like in the musical. One of the big turning points in the musical is when the narrator is forced to their death by the rest of the characters who are fed up with what they believe the narrator's putting them through, suddenly making the characters fully responsible for their own actions. This moment makes everything after it, tonally and otherwise, make complete sense. It also, however, breaks the fourth wall in a unique way that could absolutely never work on film. Breaking the fourth wall on film is not impossible. Look at Ferris Bueller or High Fidelity or Easy A. It's something that requires a specific level of suspending your disbelief, and it's something that has to be established early on in order for the audience to buy it, and it has to involve a character directly involved in the plot, most likely the protagonist. In Into the Woods, the narrator stands on the side of the stage to tell the story until he's literally pulled into the narrative himself by the characters. He's not present in the narrative until that moment, he's omniscient. Because of what can and can't be believed on film, there would have been no way to bring in that character, but without them, it loses a significant amount of what makes Into the Woods work. The absence of the narrator is felt in Act 2 of the stage musical. In the film, James Corden just stops narrating. It's the recognition of that force and getting rid of them that raises the stakes for the characters in the show, and it's just missing in the film. By subtracting from the script rather than fully adapting to the screen, Into the Woods suffers. It's reminiscent of its source material, but it lacks a lot of what made it work in the first place. However, some of the aspects that made Into the Woods a favorite of the theater are simply unable to be translated to film. What works on stage won't particularly work on film, and Into the Woods was unfortunately a victim of that lesson, and probably would have been whether it was a Disney film or not. And I feel for James Lapine, I do. Into the Woods was so established that he and others working on the film were probably scared to make any major changes for fear of backlash from the musical's fans. Yes, some things were changed to appease Disney, but some things weren't changed to appease the fans. And I think that overhauling Into the Woods too much would have indeed lost the original intent of it. James Lapine and Rob Marshall put themselves up to a nearly impossible task, and they didn't fully stick the landing. It happens, and it's okay. What next? Since the release of Into the Woods, the landscape of movie musicals has gone in interesting directions. La La Land was the first original movie musical to make it to the Oscars since Moulin Rouge, and nearly won Best Picture. Nearly. The Greatest Showman was a huge financial hit. Rob Marshall returned to Disney to direct Mary Poppins Returns, once again with Emily Blunt and Meryl Streep. The only major direct film adaptation of a stage musical to hit theaters was Cats, which is a lot of fun. Disney also acquired the live recording of the original Broadway cast of Hamilton, rather than attempting to adapt it, which was the absolute correct move in my opinion. I recently saw a video on YouTube in which the user said the movie musical was essentially dead, and I don't think that's true. Is it different than what it once was? Of course, all film genres are. It's clear that we're not going to see another era like MGM's golden age of musicals, or the Roadshow era anytime soon, but that doesn't mean that musical film is dead or even a relic. As with any film, if you have a strong script and a strong vision and you marry the two of them together, people will buy it. And hopefully lessons learned from the mistakes of other movie musicals will be made better in new ones. There are 3 stage-to-film adaptations coming out in 2021, we can only hope. Into the Woods, in the end, was a blip. It made money, it got some Oscar nominations, and it didn't hurt anyone's careers. And I know there are people out there who genuinely enjoy the film, and I get it. There's some really nice moments in it, including on the steps of the palace, which is one of the coolest uses of soliloquy I've ever seen on film. And most of the performances in it are quite good, and it's clear that the actors are happy to be a part of this. Into the Woods was a film that was well-intentioned, and in my opinion, it's not good, it's not bad, it's just fine.